Thank you. So we're going to have a great discussion now with our four fabulous panellists, just to share some insights and get some examples through stories of some of the great work that's being done in the sector. And so I'll introduce each of our panellists in order as they're sitting. The first one here to your left is Kristin Hilton. And we have worked previously in different roles in the legal sector. So Kristen commenced her role as Victoria's Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commissioner on the 1st of June 2016. Responsible for setting high-level policy agenda, she leads the organisation in achieving its strategic agenda and is very familiar with emergency services, having been involved in reviews across the sector, as well as being chair of the Champions of Change for Fire and Emergency Services. Prior to her appointment, Kristen was the Executive Director of the legal practice with Victoria Legal Aid and has previously worked with organisations as Executive Director, Civil Justice and Access, and sadly, she's soon to leave this role. You can tell us a bit about that. Thanks, Kristen. I'd next like to introduce Emily Dwyer. I have to put my glasses on with this. Welcome, Emily. Emily is the co-director and co-founder of The Edge Effect. In the 1990s, Emily was a radio journalist in Australia with community radio stations and the ABC. In 2000, she moved to Singapore and was a freelance foreign correspondent in Southeast Asia. Since 2004, Emily's international humanitarian aid and development career began in Afghanistan. She established a national humanitarian radio program service for the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and worked on journalism, training and media development projects in Afghan universities. She's worked with Internews and the United States Institute of Peace. Emily returned to Australia in 2014, where she worked with Oxfam and as Program Director at Melbourne's Lgbtiq+ radio station, Joy 94.9, plug there. She's now co-director and co-founder of The Edge Effect. So The Edge Effect, founded in 2017, it's a specialist, diverse, SOGIESC, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, sex characteristics, humanitarian and development organisation. How'd I go? Good. Their mission there is to ensure that the rights, needs and strengths of people with diverse SOGIESC, otherwise known as LGBTIQ+ people, are addressed in disaster and conflict contexts. They design and implement programs with humanitarian and development organisations and offer training workshops on inclusion. Welcome, Emily. So we have Diane next. Diane Hertz is the CEO of the Social Research Centre, which is a full-service social research firm in Melbourne. Diane has worked on gender issues during much of her career. At the US Bureau of Labour Statistics, she designed a national time use survey that measured non-market work and led the national survey program that measured unemployment, earnings, and other indicators of women and men. She also worked as Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at the Mathematica Policy Research. The Social Research Centre recently conducted a study for DELP, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, to create a gender equality framework to support the evaluation, measurement and monitoring of standards in culture and behavioural barriers and enablers for women and men in fire and emergency services. The SRC has also recently assisted the Commission for Gender Equality and the public sector with the development of their Employee Experience Survey and guidance materials for workplace gender audits under Gender Equity Act of 2020. Welcome, Diane. And finally, our man. So Brett Curran, APM, is the Assistant Commissioner of Victoria Police's Gender Equality and Inclusion Command. Brett has over 30 years' experience of government and policing. He leads a team of dedicated and experienced police and Victorian public service professionals with a motivation to drive change and create a better, fairer Victoria Police for everyone. As a senior executive supporting gender equality, diversity and inclusion initiatives, Brett is incredibly proud to lead the command and be part of the changing culture with Victoria Police. So Victoria Police's Gender Equality and Inclusion Command was established in January 2020 in response to the findings from the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. The independent review there into sex discrimination and sexual harassment, including predatory behaviour in Victoria Police. The command is designed to be a centre of excellence to help support Victoria Police's efforts to create a gender equal workforce and achieve sustainable gender equality by 2030. Maybe sooner, can we please? Thank you. So now we'll lead on to some questions. I'm going to pose some questions of our panel, and there'll be an opportunity for you to interact and ask questions as well. So Kristen, you're closest. I might start with you. So in recent years, months, weeks and days, and I'll tell you the last 3 days have been incredibly full on for me with the march yesterday, and we were in Wangaratta together on Sunday. We've seen a lot of high-profile public authorities have to confront some really uncomfortable revelations about the prevalence of sex discrimination and sexual harassment within their organisations. Thinking about the Commission's independent reviews at Victoria Police and Ambulance Victoria, what do you think it takes to truly to trigger some really transformative change within these organisations? What's been your experience?
Thanks, Amanda. Before I answer your question, can I just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also want to acknowledge all of the women everywhere across the country who have experienced some form of sexual harassment or discrimination, and for whom, as you mentioned, the last days, weeks have probably been re-traumatising in many ways. And I also want to say that this is the first time I've appeared in 3D in the last 12 months. It's like my first live event, so it's so nice to be here. So thanks very much for inviting me. And as you mentioned, during my term, I've spent a lot of time working in emergency services with VicPol, with the CFA and the MFB, and also now with Ambulance Victoria. And I think what's common to many of those organisations, firstly, is that they are organisations that were built, and I say this benignly, sort of neutrally, it's not as a criticism, but they were built by men for men. And it's only really been in more recent years, over the last couple of decades in some circumstances, where women have been able to participate fully in those organisations, and probably not full participation really in many ways. So I think when we talk about what needs to change, we need to understand in some ways the history and the memory and the written and the unwritten rules in the organisation. The other thing that I would say is that, and it was something that one of your speakers commented on just before, is that sexual harassment is an outcome of poor organisational culture. It's also an outcome of unequal structures. And so one of the things that we found when we did our work with Victoria Police is that there were all sorts of attitudinal issues. There was a high tolerance for everyday sexism. There was a high tolerance for disrespectful behaviour. And we had to deal with those sorts of issues. But we also had to deal with all of the policies, the ways in which people come into the organisation, the way in which they are progressed or promoted through the organisation. We had to look at things like the policy around pregnancy. We had to look at dress codes. We had to look at the physical infrastructure. We had to look at interview panels. So there were all these different types of issues that played into the resultant outcome, which was a high tolerance of sexual harassment or sexual discrimination. And much of what we saw, and this is I think true in the other organisations that I've worked in, is that if you have sexual harassment, then you're also likely to have bullying, you're also likely to have exclusion, you're also likely to have demeaning behaviour, because in many situations sexual harassment is used as a form of coercive control. Even if it's done so unwittingly, it's a form of power and it's a form of abuse of power. And that accompanies many other sorts of behaviours in organisations like this, where you perhaps don't fit the traditional mould of what is a good paramedic, who is a good cop, and who is a firefighter. And those stereotypes, if you like, are also bound up in a type of hero archetype that is sometimes very difficult to unpick. And so we need to radically rethink what heroism is. Heroism is not about shutting down when someone says that they're not okay. Heroism is not about turning a blind eye to the way in which a woman or someone who doesn't fit that mould is treated in your organisation. We have to completely rethink what it means to be a good cop, what it means to be a good paramedic, what it means to be a good firefighter. And we won't do that until we achieve some form of equality in our organisations. Women need not just to be seated at the table, we need to completely transform the room. This is not just about inviting women into an organisation that already has its structures and its systems and its cultures and its attitudes fixed. And there is definitely movement, and Brett will probably talk about this. We spent 4 or 5 years working with Victoria Police. They did much of the hard work, and they're continuing to do that. But we saw tremendous progress because they dared to get very, very deep into the detail. This wasn't just about, here's a gender equality policy, we don't tolerate sexual harassment, there you go, we've said it, end of story. This was about understanding in intimate detail what the experiences of women and men and people who are gender diverse are in that organisation. And it meant unpicking every policy, structure, promotion, progression. And that's really hard work, as Brett will attest to, and it's also about bringing in people who have different capabilities. But we saw in a really short space of time, really, that the gender pay gap decreased by 2% in Victoria Police, which is about 4 times the national average of the reduction. We saw an increase of flexible work by 20% in the space of 18 months, and 11% of that 20% was an uptake of flexible work by men. And as difficult as it is for women to get flexible work, it's probably about 5 times more difficult for men because of the stigma still attached to it. So I'm very hopeful about the sort of galvanising national conversation that we are having and the fact that so many people are saying enough is enough. But I'm not so optimistic that if we don't do the very, very hard work that needs to be done at an organisational level, that these brave women and men coming forward and telling their stories of sexual harassment is going to turn the dial without the really difficult and vigilant work that needs to be done.
Thanks, Kristen. I might ask you in a minute about some of the leadership responsibilities, but since we've put Brett in the limelight, I might just go to you now and give you a chance to respond. So you've been a police officer for over 30 years. I just would be really interested in your insights in how you have seen the change in focus on gender equality across the span of those 30 years.
Yeah, thank you. Can I too acknowledge the Wiradjuri and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I can also just acknowledge that it's a very rare event, emergency services event, where the men are outnumbered to the degree we are. You can count every man in the room, and that's a good thing. But I'm acutely aware that that is a very rare thing in the emergency sector space. So more of that into the future. It's nearly. This is my 40th year. I joined in '81 as a cop. I was the son of a mother who taught all my life. I didn't know anything really different from women who worked. That was something that I grew up with. My mother was a fierce feminist, so I was brought up understanding those values. Joining Victoria Police was quite a shock because in my squad there were 2 women and 28 men. Then as I went through, I went to Broadmeadows and went to Footscray. I can name every woman I worked with in the 80s because there weren't many of them. I couldn't possibly name every man. And I'm reluctant ever to talk through the prism of the women in my life, unlike some men, and see issues through their eyes. But my sister joined 4 years after me, and we got to track our careers together. Jack's now a detective superintendent at crime and had a career that I admire greatly. The reason I raised Jack is that she was the second woman in the homicide squad. She got there in the mid-90s. That's a staggering thing to think about, that given that most murder victims through the entire history of Victoria Police would have been women, that they were investigated solely by men. through that period. And the woman who came before Jacqueline, had only joined in the late 80s. And it took Jack 12 applications to get into the homicide squad, having been an experienced sexual crimes investigator for many years before that. Picking up on what Holly said before, I was traumatised when it took me 2 goes to get a job. But then I was a man, and I was inexperienced at structural discrimination against me because it just didn't happen. I could be different and not be affected. So in answer to your question, where have we been? So I was lucky enough, in fact, one of the most inspirational people I've ever worked with was to go and work in Christine Nixon's office. And Christine, as many of you will know, was the first Chief Commissioner of any police service in the Asia Pacific, and indeed one of the first in the world. And out of that, working with Christine, I left Victoria Police in 2007, and I stupidly and arrogantly thought that, well, we're on a trajectory here. There are many great women coming through. Christine's led the change, and we are going to be really well served. And a number of those women, Andrew talked about before, Wendy Steendam, Tess Walsh, Lucinda Nolan, and many other women who were in crime, had sort of started to employ many more women and those sorts of things. So that was back in the 2000s. I came back in 2014 as a superintendent in Victoria Police, so that was only 7 years. There were 87 superintendents then. I could do Juliet's trick and ask you to all put your hands up and guess how many there were, but the fact was that there were 4 out of 87 who were women. I was flabbergasted. I was quite shocked that that's where we were. And when we looked down through the ranks, and it's not as if we didn't have men who were committed to this leading the organisation, but the structural and systemic issues that we had needed EOHRC to come in and call out those problems. Now, I won't repeat the stats that Kristen's put to you, but notwithstanding the work we've done, and we've done a lot of work around our policies, our selection processes, parental leave is much easier. We've got backfill now, so there's not that terrible discussion where women were embarrassed to go and tell their managers that they were, instead of celebrating it, they were embarrassed to go and say because they had to, apologise for the fact that this was going to affect the workplace. We put in place proper backfill so that that's not even a discussion. And in fact, many women can choose to stay at work, and their partners, who are often police, can, if they're men, go off and be the carer or the primary carer for the children. So we're on a trajectory that is good. I suppose for me though, I think the big thing is that I heard Janine Hendry last night. I was watching the project, and she was talking about the marches yesterday, and she said she was marching 40 years ago, and here she is marching again yesterday. And I suppose what always saddens me, it doesn't shock me, it just saddens me, that EOHRC does a review, or some other commensurate body does a review. The male leaders of an organisation are all shocked at the prevalence of sexual harassment and disadvantage to women. And then we talk about what we go forward. Well, this conversation's been going on a long time. And so the reason why we've implemented our 10-year strategy of Equal, Safe and Strong is that we have to embed cultures and practices and policies that mean that we don't have a review in 15 years' time where hopefully the woman in charge of the organisation expresses shock and dismay at the prevalence of inequality and sexual harassment, that we've actually achieved that proper gender equity in our workplace.
And just quickly, before I go on to you, Diane, can you sort of pinpoint the trigger? What was the trigger to say this needs to change, something needs to shift?
Look, I think Ken Lay was the Chief Commissioner when he and Ken was and is a friend of mine. We disagree on many things. He barracks for Essendon and I barrack for Carlton. That's a pretty big thing. But But I think you only had to look around you in that organisation and go, where are the women? And then the fact that still now only 25% of our women are subject to, say, sexual harassment or predatory behaviour. Only 11 feel confident to talk about it, that is to report it. And of those 11%, there will be a way smaller percent, which we haven't calculated, who would want absolutely no part in any sort of public, exposure of that. So the trigger for Ken, I know, and was the fact that he looked around him and just saw that there weren't the women that there should have been in the organisation. And then there's the horrific stories that people hear, and then that caused us to have to do what we did. I think organisationally and societally, we thought that we were on a trajectory, and that stopped. And I heard Juliet say before about us. I thought I was probably when I had us in the 30s. And then to think that we'd fallen so far since 2014. I think that's the thing, is that in the 2000s, like I said, we thought, well, here we go. We just stopped, and there's no prospect, if I think politically, of there being a female Prime Minister of this country anytime soon. And that's the same in Victoria, and we're supposed to be the paragon of those things. Hopefully the next Victoria Police Chief Commissioner is a woman.
Thanks, Brett. Diane, let's talk about research. So some foreign emergency service agencies have been working hard, as we've heard, to improve gender equality for a few years now, and some for longer. With the Social Research Centre's gender equality work that you did with DELP, what areas stood out in need of most attention, drawing on the research that you did? And specifically with DELP, but if you want to bring anything in, feel free.
Yeah, I'll talk from two heads, if you don't mind. So one is the CEO of the Social Research Center, and the other is a prior position as Chief Diversity Officer at a policy research firm in the U.S. It's really hard for me to separate those two things since I've done both research and implementation. So at Social Research Center for DELP, we did some work at their behest for the Forest Fire Management Victoria to really look at their gender equity efforts. And what they wanted was a framework where they could look at different domains of progress and find out ways to measure those domains and monitor them over time. So one of the things Social Research Center does really well is surveys and survey questions and analyzing data and setting up these kinds of systems to track things. So that's what they came to us for. As data people, data, in my view, are directional in this area. Data aren't they're not necessarily going to tell you what to do. They're going to tell you where the problems are and also where the strengths and enablers are, so barriers and enablers. But once you get those data, then it's really important to think about, well, where am I implementing this? Because a solution in one organization and might not work in another one. I'll just give you a couple of figures. So one of the things that emerged with the DELP study, again, for forest fire, which involved lots of organizations, Parks Victoria, Melbourne Water, DELP, and a few others, there were big gaps in what men and women thought, right? So percentage of men that thought that men and women were treated equally was 60%, where that was 40% for women. I thought this one was really interesting. Then the percentage of women that should lead, more women should lead. So do you believe that more women should be in leadership? Women, 80% of women said absolutely. 47% of men said yes. So they're not necessarily convinced, and not all women either, that having more women in leadership is an important thing. But what was even more interesting was coupling that with another question, which was, we should target the recruitment of women. So how many, you would be shocked, I think, to see that only 47% of women said yes to that. So fewer than half of women think they should target women, and yet the organization has a 50% target. So how is this going to be achieved? So one of the important things that I've learned around diversity is that to try to take this conversation away from target women or target blacks or target to use language that's more in the US, target LGBT. It's really about diversity and recognizing that diversity of thought, as Susan mentioned at the beginning, is so critical to productivity and so critical to profit if you're a for-profit, but service in something like the justice and emergency management system, you're serving such a diverse group of stakeholders that to not have diversity in leadership means there's a gap between who's making the decisions and who's being served. So it's really important to bridge that gap. So how do you do that in this situation? One of the things that I think we've learned from a lot of diversity work is that recruitment pipelines are full of bias. All of us have bias. So the education system is biased too. So women are less likely to put their names in the ring, and then women are less likely to apply for jobs because there's a lot of research that shows that women apply for jobs they know they can do. They run down the list and they find out all 10 things I can do. Okay, maybe I can apply. Men apply for jobs when they can do half of those things. And then when it comes to promotion, a lot of times what happens is women are promoted if they've proven they can do the job. Men are promoted on the potential they can do the job. So these kinds of biases exist at every single level. So taking the conversation away from targeting groups is really important, and taking the conversation to how do we identify and reduce bias at every stage of the process so everyone has a chance is really important. So those are some of the things that came up in that study. I can talk more. There was stuff around training, deployment, promotion, networks, and so forth. I'll provide more later in the conversation.
Thanks, Diane. Emily, it's good to see you again. I haven't seen you for a few years. I'm going to just change the tone of the conversation a little bit and start by asking, can you just explain to us some of the ways that LGBTIQ plus people are impacted in emergencies and disasters?
I just want to also acknowledge I work on the land of the Dungurung people. I've come in from Buxton today, so if there's anyone from Murrindindi, hello and thank you. And I also know that I'm a fill-in for Ro Allen, and I'm certainly not Ro Allen, but I'll do my best to communicate some of the interesting and good things that are happening in Victoria at the moment, as well as some of the challenges. I do a lot of my work in international humanitarian and development contexts, so looking at disasters or conflict in parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. But I think so I'll speak a little bit about that, but also then sort of draw some connections between that to the experiences of people who live through disasters and engage with emergency services in a place like Victoria. So I think the first sort of driver of the challenges that people experience is what happens before emergencies. So long before anyone comes in contact with a cyclone or comes in contact with emergency responders, they've been living a life where there is potential for all kinds of different marginalisation and discrimination. So LGBTIQ people might be excluded from their families. They might experience violence in their families. They might choose to leave home. They might be asked to leave home. They might experience discrimination in their faith communities. Many LGBTIQ people are people of faith, and this is deeply disturbing for them. They might be forced out of local communities. They might end up in cities, in places which they don't know, and all of the wonderful and challenging things that happen in cities. They might experience discrimination in schools, trying to access work, accessing public services, at hospitals, all kinds of places. And all of this happens before the cyclone strikes or bushfire happens, and so forth. But all of those experiences, I guess, have two main effects. Sort of one is that people's resiliency is not what it might have otherwise been. So in some sense, people are starting from behind. I guess the other thing is that the kinds of violence and discrimination that people experience in everyday life doesn't stop just because there's a disaster. It continues. And people have learned that if I experience violence in everyday life, then maybe when I go to an evacuation shelter, I'm also going to experience violence there. So, for example, a story from Tonga, Tropical Cyclone Gita a year or two ago. There was someone who is a lady, so you can think of it as a transgender woman, kind of. who was living in a family that with ladies and some other people. The roof of the house blew off. The emergency shelter in the place in that particular village was a faith organisation's location. They didn't feel safe there, so they took the rest of the family and the kids to that church and then went back and saw out the tropical cyclone in the house that had already had half its roof blown off. And these are the kinds of stories that we hear all the time. Bringing this back to Australia, I think there have been huge advances in Australia over the last 40 years in terms of the rights of people with diverse SOGS or LGBTIQ people. But there are still huge challenges. And I've just got a couple of statistics for you. So this is from the Australian Human Rights Commission in 2014. LGBTIQ people, of the LGBTIQ people surveyed, 34% hid the fact that they were LGBTIQ when accessing services, 42% hid that in attending social and community events, and 39% hid that in terms of work. And those are relatively recent figures. And people also experience more violence, people also experience more depression. Coming in, I think what often that means is that LGBTIQ people look for ways to protect themselves. Their homes become very important, their networks become very, very important. In a disaster, when those kinds of those things are put at risk, then people kind of feel like some of that safety net has been pulled away. Recently, I had experienced pain which I thought was a heart attack, and an ambulance service came. In amongst everything else, there was this sort of conversation that was going on in my head. Have they worked out that I'm trans yet? Do I need to tell them I'm trans for medical reasons? And is it going to be safe for me to do so? And so that's a conversation that sort of just goes on in people's heads all the time. Is it real? Well, according to research done in 2018 amongst your colleagues, 52% said that there was a greater risk, LGBTIQ people would have had a greater risk of harassment in emergencies. 60% disagreed with the notion that their colleagues in emergency services had a good understanding of the needs of LGBTIQ people, and 51% disagreed with the notion that LGBTIQ people would receive quality service. So there's challenges which are just part of everyday life, and then there's challenges in terms of the ways that organisations respond.
Thank you. I'm going to come back and ask you some more about, with an audience of emergency services in the room, Emily, but I'll come back to you, Kristen. And I did mention it would be really interesting to understand a little bit about what can the leaders of organisations do to address some of the issues, and you can wrap that up in another question, COVID. So hopefully everyone in the room is aware of the studies and the reports and the findings that we've seen about the impact of COVID has had, particularly on women, from loss of jobs to lower incomes to taking on more chores at home and in the workplace, additional responsibilities with respect to caring and parenting. So coming out the other side of COVID, so what lessons from that experience do you think that we can use that will help workplaces make sure that we don't lose momentum and slide backwards as a result of a pandemic when we were potentially making steps forward?
I'll deal with maybe the leadership question first, although they're interrelated. You would have all heard by now that leadership sets the tone and that it starts at the top, and that's completely true. And I think that we understand now that leaders have got to do more than send out an email saying that we don't tolerate sexual harassment in this workplace. So there's a few things that I would say, and first is, who are you recruiting into your leadership positions? Because leadership is not just about the Chief Commissioner or the CEO. It's about leadership, at the executive level, but also how you are instilling a sense of leadership throughout your organisation, and what good leadership means in your organisation. I think gender equality and diversity should be a KPI in every leader in the organisation. I think it should be something that leaders regularly report to at their board level. I think it should be as important as any other risk to the organisation in terms of a work health and safety sort of perspective. So it is about how leaders actually bake in the importance of gender equality and diversity in their organisation and how they're held to account for it. And then it's about how they role model that through the organisation. But that's not just in, I suppose, thought and deed. It's also about taking the responsibility to build manager capability. And we've spoken a little bit about that before in terms of if you're someone that goes and reports sexual harassment to your manager or makes a flexible work request, it may be that your manager has never received training on how to deal with those issues or how to have those conversations. So you have got to enhance the ability for people to lead and to be able to respond and prevent have those sorts of conversations at all levels throughout the organisation. The other thing I would say about leadership is that you can have the best intentions as a leader in an organisation, but if you are not the authorising environment of your organisation, then it's very, very difficult. And by that I mean, what are your industrial agreements? What are the other parts of, what's the environment that makes up the decisions that you can take and the action that you can take on certain things? And I know that's a controversial thing to say, but it's a true thing to say as well, because I know that there are people who have led organisations that are represented in this room and have had the best of intentions and have wanted to make change, and some of the obstacles towards making that change are still in place. In terms of COVID, there is one of the things that we found when we worked with CFA and MFB, with VicPol, and now also with Ambulance Victoria, is the lack of flexibility that's available to women and men in the organisation. Every organisation that I have worked with, not just those ones, have this sense of uniqueness or exceptionalism. So if I go and talk to doctors, for example, they say, well, we can't do flexible work here. Same with police. We can't have the sort of flexibility that you might have in an office environment. Same with fire. We're only quite early on in our review with AV, but it's sort of the sorts of things that we're saying to here. Everyone thinks their environment is unique. Miners, engineers. And that might be true. Their environment might be unique to their organisation, which means that they have to come up with the bespoke model of flexibility that works for their organisation. And that involves listening to the people in your organisation who want flexibility and how it's going to work for them. I quoted the 20% increase in flexibility at Victoria Police. It's doable. It is absolutely doable, and it will improve people's productivity, and it will improve people's loyalty to the organisation, and it will mean that you get a more diverse range of people coming through and a more diverse range of people being elevated and progressed and promoted through the organisation. We've had a proof of concept in terms of flexibility over the last 12 months. We've had to radically embrace digital technologies, which means that we can work from home. And of course that is not as possible for some frontline roles, but it's meant that we've had to get our heads around how flexibility will work. So we've got this golden opportunity now to actually take hold of some of the things that we thought were just too hard and make sure that our organisation is embedding flexible and hybrid working practices. One of the things that I would say about COVID, and it has had a disproportionate impact on women in terms of how many women have lost their jobs, how many people have had a pay reduction, and that's particularly so if you're in casual or part-time work, how many women have disproportionately borne caring responsibilities. My husband would probably argue with me, but I'm sure I have disproportionately borne that burden. I had 3 school-aged children and I was working full-time from home last year. So, that was pretty tough. And also it has entrenched other forms of gender equality. It hasn't created them, it's exacerbated them. But there is an opportunity here. And one of the things that we've started to see, which is, I think, the downside of some of this proof of concept, is that men are returning to the workplace in higher numbers than women are. And that has a consequence for presenteeism. So who gets the informal kind of conversations about professional development, or who just because they're on the floor next to the boss says, oh, you should go on this training course, or you should put your hand up for that acting role. So we have to be really careful when we start to develop hybrid working places that we are ensuring that there is visibility and there is a consciousness around these different working conditions, even if you are not on the floor the whole time. And the other thing that I would say in relation to sexual harassment and discrimination is that because economic insecurity, which women have felt more keenly than men, but I don't just want to make this a gender issue, even, many people have felt over the last 12 months, they are becoming, at the same time that we're having these very public conversations about harassment, they are becoming more ambivalent about negotiating equal pay, more ambivalent about speaking up about sexual harassment or poor conduct because they're genuinely worried about losing their jobs and they genuinely can't afford to. I mean, sexual harassment isn't just a human rights or a workplace safety issue, it is an economic security issue. I have spent hundreds of hours in conversation with women and some men who have walked away from their jobs, who have lost their career trajectory, who have never got it back because of the conduct that they have received in the workplace. And that's not just that doesn't just affect them psychologically, that has a huge rippling effect on their economic security. So I think it's really important that as leaders of the organisation, and I don't just mean the CEOs, I mean anyone with any leadership responsibility in the organisation, that we're critically aware of these issues and that we take this opportunity now to try and really understand those experiences and create new workplaces that are fairer and more inclusive.
Thanks. Wow, I feel a bit sad. Emily, I'm going to come back to you and trick Brett because I saw you getting ready there, because I think there's a really interesting segue there talking about flexibility. And I want to ask you, you've got a room full of people with open ears and open hearts from emergency service organisations, and I'd really love for you to share with them some of your messages, reflections, insights or ideas around inclusivity for LGBTIQ plus people, both in their organisations supporting people who have been impacted in a disaster context, but also people that want to come and volunteer in their organisations. What advice have you got for them?
Well, how long have you got?
Susan will tell me 5 minutes.
Okay. So I think, one of the great things is that there is an increased openness to the kinds of stories and the diverse stories that exist within the community, but also within the organisations that you work for. Now, there isn't one LGBTIQ story. And for example, experiences of women who are also people with diverse SOGS, women who are lesbian, bisexual, trans, intersex and queer, can often be quite different from the experiences of men with diverse SOGS. And when we look at LGBTIQ organisations, often the G is kind of loud and drowns out some other aspects of the community. So I think the fact that some of this research is being done, that we've been talking about, and that these stories are emerging is really positive. I think one of the things, and this sort of certainly resonates, Kristen, some of the other things we've been talking about here, is that the kinds of challenges that your organisations face are ones that are often sort of deeply embedded and part of cultures of organisations, and ones that sort of a 2-hour D&I workshop are not necessarily going to provide the solutions. So if we think back to, I don't know, let's think back to primary school. We're all in grade 3. We're asked to draw a picture of a family. Imagine it in your head now. So I won't ask for shows of hands or things, but I would imagine that many people then, and probably still now, have imagined, a mum, a dad, and X number of kids. So there's an assumption when we're talking about families that there is a heterosexual relationship at the heart of those families. So to use fancy language, it's an example of heteronormativity. So there are norms which are deeply embedded within the ways that we think and live as people, within the ways that our organisations do assessments, the way that our organisations write, the photographs that are used in publications, the way why the recruitment is done, the way promotions happen, all kinds of things. So there's a series of norms that sort of cut across all of that work. Addressing those norms requires a lot of work. And we recently worked with the Australian Volunteers Program, which is, I mention it because it's an organisation that like many of yours, recruits volunteers and deploys them, in its case, largely overseas. And they came to us with a knowledge that there were challenges, but that they wanted to develop exemplary practice. And they sort of opened up the organisation, and we sort of looked at all of their policies. We looked at how they did recruitment, what the story of the organisation was that was being put out into the community, what people's experiences were in training, what people's experiences were when they were deployed, when they wanted to make complaints, when they came home, when they had mental health issues because they'd experienced violence or discrimination. And I think it requires organisations to throw all of that open and to be really brave, like the Australian Volunteers Program was brave. It discovered some things that it wasn't amazingly happy to discover. But in doing so, it then created an opportunity for a conversation. And in that international context, there were lots of questions about, could this conversation be had with organisations we work with in Indonesia or in other parts of the world? And the answer was yes. That there are actually a lot of people in different regional offices and country offices around the world who really, really wanted to have that conversation, but didn't feel like there'd been that creation of that genuine space. There'd been, I guess, a sense, and this is certainly not. I'll stop talking about the Australian Volunteers Program at this point and sort of say more generally. I think there's a sense amongst LGBTIQ people that inclusion is often passive. It's like, well, it's fine for you to be LGBTIQ. We're going to leave you kind of navigate through all of this yourself, or provide you with some resources, but we're not going to sort of actively try and change our whole organisation. But it's LGBTIQ people are not the problem. The problem is the rest of organisations which are discriminating against LGBTIQ people or excluding LGBTIQ people. So there's a real need for a kind of a whole of organisation approach that looks at those cultural those norms, looks at how they're expressed, that goes beyond a 2-hour workshop and really sort of gets to the heart of what is it that's going to make people feel like they belong. So there's diversity, there's inclusion, there's belonging. Yeah? Mm. So you can be, and then in the wacky world of HR professionals on LinkedIn, people talk about, you can be invited to the party, you can be asked to get up and dance, or you can dance like no one cares. And dancing like no one cares is when you feel like you belong to that organisation, because you feel, if you make a complaint, people are going to take it seriously. It's not going to get, the privacy issues are going to be respected. It's not going to be shared around. It's not going to backfire on you. And all of those things that make you feel like you're really part of this.
One of my favourite Dr. Seuss sayings, why blend in when you were born to stand out? So you're going to stick around later, Emily, because I suspect, hopefully a lot of people come and ask you some questions and we can pass on your details. Diane, Susan's going to be jumping up and down in a minute, but I'll get to you as well, Brett, don't worry. Got a good one. You've got a lot of data and information research, and you shared a little bit with us, but you've got a lot more, I know. Looking at all of that research and thinking about your audience now, what are the key messages from all that you've learned in all of your roles that you'd like to share with us today? Sure. In 1.5 minutes.
30 seconds, no problem. Number one is leadership. Leadership matters. It matters a lot. Stating your values, your vision, and sticking to it, and then backing it up with action. So reviewing all those policies, changing the policies, but most importantly, enforcing the policies. Leadership is really critical. They say in the diversity work, if you're going to survey people, the worst thing you can do is not come back to them with the results and not implement something. It's better to just not touch diversity than it is to say you value it and not show up. So follow through and vision are most important. And then I would say none of it works without safety. So prioritizing safety, just like in Maslow's hierarchy, and I love the title of your effort, that you said safe, equal, safe, and strong. It sounds perfect. Safety is so important, and so dealing with the issues around discrimination and harassment complaint procedures should be near the very top of the list, because you can't fix recruitment and training and deployment and all that stuff if it's an unsafe culture. So leadership, safety, all the policies. And I want to put in a special word for narrative storytelling, because one of the reasons that there are these huge gaps between perceptions of people in organizations is that they're not talking to one another. And to create a space in organizations for sharing narratives is really critical. In my former job, we created something called Humans of Mathematica, which was based on Humans of New York. And it was very intentional, because what we were trying to do is combat the notion that we were a bunch of white Ivy League elitists. It was a highly educated group. It didn't make sense to me, because we cared about policy and poverty and racism and justice. So what we started doing is saying, why did you go into this work? And then the stories emerged of abuse and immigration issues and all sorts of other things that they shared with the company. And people became human, and it broke down a lot of barriers.
Thanks, Diane. And to wrap up, because we are out of time, Brett, it's October the 26th, 2025. You're 5 years early. You wake up in the morning and you say, I did it. We've done. What does that look like? What does success look like for Victoria Police and your mission?
I think for me, it is where that point that I made before is that women, LGBTIQ, any person who feels different feels safe, and they don't feel inhibited in trying to do anything or go for anything that is right for them to go for or do in their organisation, but in the community. And I think that's more than numbers. So I'm not trying to run away from Kristin's target of 50-50 by 2030. I'm certainly not. But it's more than that, because when we have that discussion with some people, they immediately move to, all right, well then I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna only recruit women, which then of course creates backlash, but also may not recruit the right type of people. They may just have the same values and views as the men that have been selected. So success for me would also be, I think that it's entirely visible and unremarkable that there are many women, many diverse people with LGBTIQ or varying ethnic backgrounds. Like in Victoria Police, I tried to think of someone at our executive level who was not Northern European or Anglo-Celtic, and I can't think of one. We have many who identify. Many is the wrong term, but we have people who are openly out and gay or LGBTIQ, whatever they. And I would think that we have a nurturing environment for that. However, it's still remarkable. It's still talked about, and for me, that would be. And I'll tell one anecdote. I during COVID. Had the, as well as doing gender equality and inclusion, which includes diversity and inclusion, so LGBTIQ and other attributes. I was in charge of the Victoria Police response to COVID from about June. It was so we were setting up the closure of the borders, and it just so happened that every superintendent on our morning meeting for a number of mornings happened to be a woman. And the conversation, they were remote, of course, because many of them were on the borders, South Australian and New South Wales border, and a guy who's a decent guy, nobody would think of him as a bad person, comes to me and goes, "Oh God, look at that, all those women doing a good job." I was like, "What?" I said, "Why are you surprised?" He's like, "I'm not surprised. I'm not." I go, "You sounded surprised." He goes, "No, I was just pointing out that they're all." I said, "Well, why did you do that?" So I mean, the thing about that for me is that success for me is that we look around. It's a relatively gender equal workplace. It's a relatively diverse equal workplace, and nobody says anything about that. And no man who runs an organisation stands up after a review and goes, "I'm shocked. I'm totally shocked."
Thanks, Brett. inquiries and reports are really important. Data and research is really important. Leadership and commitment by organisations is important. But Emily, belonging, is that not the most important thing for everybody to feel like they belong? So can you please join me in thanking Kristen, Emily, Diane and Kristen.